Well, welcome to our class on Lamentations. And so we're going to go through Lamentations, all 5 chapters. So I feel like we almost got a break tonight after the 25 chapters of peace in Jeremiah. And Louise, I would be interested in you sharing. You shared a little bit before that you thought Lamentations was easier to read than Jeremiah.
Much, much, much easier. I mean, sure, it's a lament, it's sadness. I understand that, but it didn't have all of that stuff with Jeremiah where God is saying to undo the people. I told you that bothered me because that's not my image of God that was in Jeremiah all the way through. So, yeah.
Yeah, this one, Lamentations, is less of a image of God being painted and more of just a lament, people lamenting what's happening and asking
I
where
took
where
it
is God?
as how he felt, yeah, Jeremiah, and how and they felt about the loss of Jerusalem. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Simple.
Lamentations is traditionally connected with Jeremiah still,
Mhm.
and so it's traditionally attributed to Jeremiah. However, Louise, as you pointed out, the style is quite a bit different, and so it's scholars think it's unlikely that it was actually written by Jeremiah, even though it's
Really?
attributed to. It's located right by Jeremiah in the Christian Bible, but it is not in that same place in the Hebrew Bible. So in the Hebrew Bible, it's located in the writings section instead of with the prophets, which gives that a little bit of a different feel to it, whether it's being connected with the prophets or with the writings. But we're kind of in the same time period, we're estimating that so we've got the events of Jeremiah and the people are going into exile. And so after 586, and this is being written while the people are in exile. But what's interesting is it seems that Lamentations maybe wasn't written by the people who are in exile, but the people who remained as part of the remnant that stayed in the Jerusalem wider area. And so we get to hear from those people who were kind of left behind away from those who are in exile. And so this gives us into the 6th century, sometime probably before 520 BCE, because that's when there's rebuilding that's occurring. And so during a time period where everything feels pretty dark and not really sure what's coming up next, if there will be rebuilding, when there will be freedom from what all has occurred, and just a lot of pain that we hear in Lamentations. So it's likely it's written by those who remained in the land in Judah. And the other thing that's interesting about Lamentations that's different from other Mesopotamian laments, because remember, we're looking at prophecies and writings from the Mesopotamian area, and we're looking from the Israelite culture, but there's a plethora of other cultures that have their own writings too. And so there are other Mesopotamian laments that are occurring because there were other cultures who were also decimated by the Babylonians and sent into exile, and others who were left behind from that. But unlike other Mesopotamian laments, Lamentations ends with God being silent. Many of the other laments end with a positive note, but Lamentations does not. It ends just with silence, which is an interesting place for it to end. The other thing about Lamentations is a collection of poetry. And we don't get this when we just read through it in English, but it's actually done in such a way that chapters 1 through 4 are alphabetic acrostic in Hebrew. And so they go through the 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and each line begins with a different letter. with the exception of chapter 3. And in chapter 3, which is a little longer, all the verses, the 3 verses of each stanza begin with the same letter. So you would have Aleph, and then you'd have Bet, and you'd go through the Hebrew letters in that way, but it's still in the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, which is interesting in that some poets, as they read this, it's like the poet was giving structure to mass chaos, and so 1 through 4 is held by the Hebrew alphabet, but chapter 5 is not. And so we have that the first 2 chapters held by the alphabet. We've got chapter 3, a longer poem held by the alphabet, all this grief being held in some form of structure, chapter 4 as well, and then 5 that falls away, and we end with God being silent. And so even the structure itself seems to be that trying to contain chaos, and yet it feels like chaos takes over, even within the structure. The lines of the poetry are also in Hebrew are unbalanced. And so as you read through it in Hebrew, you kind of get a sense that even the structure itself is showing the imbalance that grief causes, and how that leaves the world just in a whole new way, and often just off of how things were understood before. And even the poetry structure shows that. So that's kind of the structure and the time period that we're in. Any initial thoughts of Lamentations as you read it? Or thoughts on the poetry structure that you picked out? I know some of you read poems and enjoy poetry. So what did you pick up from your experience and knowledge of poetry?
I'm just reading.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there was, I was listening to a Hebrew scholar talking about Lamentations and about the poetry in the Bible. And he was talking about how the best, like, people say, well, how can I read the poetry of the Bible when I don't read Hebrew? And to be honest, the people say, I'm never going to learn Hebrew. Like, it's kind of difficult to learn and I just don't have time. Like, I'm not going to learn Hebrew. So how can I read the Bible in the poetry pieces better without learning Hebrew? And he pointed out there's a lot of ways to do it. And one of the main ways is to read poetry. Not just read biblical poetry, but read classical poetry, read all different types of poetry, so that you get a better sense of how language is used in a poetic way, and read from different authors. And with that knowledge and that experience, then go back and read biblical poetry again. And then you're able to bring that feeling and that experience of being immersed in poetry as you're reading the biblical poetry. The other thing you pointed out was that when you're reading through poetry, you never read a poem once and then you're done. Like, that's not how poetry works. Poetry is intended, it carries more than just the words themselves, but it carries the emotions, it carries the feelings, it carries the things which we don't have words for. And so to read a poem once and read it again and read it again and read it again, keep reading it until you know it so well that you're suddenly more able to hear the emotions and the feelings within that. And to do the same thing with biblical poetry. And so Lamentations would be a book that you wouldn't want to just read once, but maybe you'd take a chapter and you'd read it through 10 times just to let yourself get into it and start to hear it and feel it in a new way. And so as we look at Lamentations, we're not going to look at it the same as Jeremiah because it's a different structure. Part of Jeremiah was prose and Lamentations poetry. So we'll do a lot less of this is like what's happening in the world, this and this, but it's more about how our experience of the reading and how that affects us. So I want to show you a video, but first, Mary's. Mary share. May I share with Mary? Mary wrote that it's that Lamentations is so sad because there has been nothing comparable in her life. Maybe the experience of millions in World War II is somewhat comparable, very sobering. In our God is still speaking era, we haven't had to grapple with God being silent.
Right.
Yeah. Well said, Mary. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It is scary, and I can't like just the amount of pain and amount of hurt in this time, and it's not something that we can comprehend from where we live in the world. There are other places, and I think this would be an interesting book to read alongside someone who has lived as a refugee, or somebody who has escaped a war-torn area, and to read it alongside them and ask them, tell me about your experience, and tell me about how this poem kind of speaks to things maybe you've been through or doesn't. What do you hear in it that's because there are still people in the world who are walking through this too, this type of suffering as well. And even I wanted to show, there's a video, which I want to share my screen now. And this is, oh, actually she introduces herself, so I'll let her share it herself. Make sure I share the sound, so there we go. This talks a little bit about just the trauma people experience and how that we hear Lamentations. I apologize, my computer's been running a little slow tonight, but we'll get it moving. Can you hear?
Yes, that is my prop for Lamentations. All right, in my books. My name is Dr. Cynthia Erickson, and I am the chair of the PsyD program in the School of Psychology, and I'm an associate professor of clinical psychology. My area of study and research is trauma, psychological trauma, and I am introducing the Book of Lamentations. In my work, I get drawn into those really complex and challenging spaces of pain and tragedy and brokenness and evil and grief. And the Book of Lamentations is an extraordinary opportunity within the canon of Scripture for us to explore that together. I didn't really know until this project that the Book of Lamentations is actually made up of 5 poems. And 4 of those poems use what's called the Acrostic Style. And that means that each of the Hebrew letters of the alphabet, all 22 of them, are what begins stanzas of each of 4 of the poems in Lamentations. The 5th one, the 5th chapter of the book, is a poem that doesn't use that style, but is still a lament. All of them are laments. They're funeral dirges, they're ways of expressing deep pain, they're ways of crying out to God. They have really horrendous things in them, ways that people have been hurt, ways that God has brought punishment, ways that God has left people alone, and the writers, the poets, are crying out in a variety of ways. As a psychologist and as someone who specializes in trauma particularly, It feels odd to say this, but I am so incredibly glad that those poems are in our canon. They're so important. It's so important that we have spaces where we can be honest and we have examples in these poems of what it honestly means to cry out to God, asking, where are you? Why has this happened? What's going on? There aren't just laments in the Book of Lamentations, there are also laments in the Psalms, and there are pieces of lament in the Book of Job. But I didn't hear those much growing up because there was a lot of emphasis on things going well and God being good and God providing and God sustaining, which are all fantastic and really important characteristics of God. But there are also seasons in our lives where God feels distant or where it feels like God is not hearing our cries, or we are experiencing the consequences of our sin, whether that's sins that we've done or lies that we've believed. There are consequences that are painful and disruptive and disorienting in our life. And the Book of Lamentations is that. One of the things that I so appreciate about the Book of Lamentations is that it doesn't end with a happy ending. It actually ends with a lot of tension and with a lot of uncertainty. I'm going to read the last part of Lamentations 5:19-22. You, Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. Why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us so long? Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return, renew our days as of old. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. The reality is that there are times in all of our Christian lives when we are in this in-between. We might be confident that God reigns, but don't see it in the space that we are. We wonder where God's justice is, and we don't see God moving yet. So for me, this leads to that question of how will we lament? Will we be honest with God in the midst of that uncertainty, in the midst of that pain? Will we be willing to open up all the incredibly disorienting and maybe even horrifying things that we're feeling or experiencing and be honest with God about those? Will we walk forward as a community and call for justice, confessing our sins, lamenting the ways that we have not been the gospel person that we want to be, or the gospel people that we want to be? When we don't see that an outcome is clear, can we still lament? And can we hope and trust in this in-between? That is my prayer.
Any thoughts after hearing that introduction from Dr. Erickson?
It's kind of like what's happening in our world today, where they're talking about in the last chapter they're talking about the crisis you have befallen us, and their homes, our nations are filled with foreigners. We are orphans, our fathers are dead, our mothers are widowed. Many times what's happening with the people that are now the immigrants are coming in, some of them are very heavy laden, but yet everything else is like we pay for our water we drink, our fuel is higher than ever. And there's all this I want to say not tension, but all this going on, and everybody's getting so where they're wondering what's going to happen next in this world and so on and so forth. And they're lamenting here that, did we move too far from our Lord, or did we, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but anyway, I just got to thinking about all this. Kind of reminded me of how we as a nation need to stick together and lament together and work together, and so.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly are not going through here as with the type of security that we do have We're not going through the same thing that the people who wrote Lamentations are going through, but there is still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of pain, and everybody's in a different place with that. The line, I'm glad you said it too, Helen, we must pay for the water we drink. That one actually made me chuckle a little bit when I
Yeah,
reread it, just because
I
we
love
pay
that.
for
It's
bottled water and like,
yeah, I know. And then our fuel is sold at the highest prices. I mean, that the price of the fuel did go up. You know, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's like today. You know, in some respects. But anyway, yeah.
yeah, there's some common struggles that humanity continues to go through, those struggles of how do I meet my basic needs, and that sometimes we price basic needs out of people's reach. And
Yeah.
we still do that. We have affordable housing crisis here in Bismarck. We have affordable housing crisis across in shelter. That's a basic necessity that people need.
That's right.
It's people can't, if you don't have, I remember talking with somebody, or they were telling me about they were having trouble getting somebody to take their medication, and they couldn't figure out why. Like, they kept just getting them more and giving them medication, and they just wouldn't take it, and they needed the medication to be healthy, and finally figured out they didn't have a refrigerator at home, and the medication had to be refrigerated, and so they didn't have any way to keep their medication to be able to take it, and because it had been priced out of their range of being able to get a refrigerator. And so those types of things, that it's a lament that our community still does experience, that sometimes we hear and sometimes we don't always hear, because they become hidden stories in our community too.
That's right.
Yeah, and sometimes when we read through the scriptures, we can, it's reading what's happening in history and reading where we come from, but it also can open our eyes to, where is this still occurring? Where are we still being impacted as a community by these type of laments, because of whatever our world is like, or whatever society is doing, or what things we are doing too, as individuals and collectively. But like how the Dr. Erickson said, was how important it is to have places to express trauma and grief. It's just absolutely essential to be able to have places where you can express truly how you feel and be able to express yourself and to be fully known. And that is one of the things we often yearn for, to be fully known, and to know that God fully knows us. And that means that our laments are very welcome too, because our trauma and our laments, God wants to hear those too. And God is in those places with us, even when God feels so far from us.
Bob Eastgate's commercial on television talks about grief, but grief shared. He talks about grief shared. Grief kept doesn't help, but grief shared, will help heal. And they have people help with that. And I know my mom, my father died very, very unexpectedly, and my mother never accepted that. Her church offered her a grief counselor, and I don't need that. But for 6 years, she lived on, just not accepting the fact that Dad died the way he did, but she wouldn't accept grief counseling. And there's a lot of that in this town now that's offered for people. And there's more than grief and losing a spouse, but yeah, lots of grief, jobs, finances. There's a thing on television tonight about, you talk about houses, something, I didn't follow the whole thing. Houses are being priced out of range for people who just want to buy a house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's Lamentations about that. There was a book that came out. This was it was from the Still Speaking Writers group of the United Church of Christ. I don't know if you've seen that. It's a little thin little book, like not thick at all. Emerge Blessings and Rituals for Unsheltering. And it came out as things started to reopen after we had so many closures across the country because of COVID. And in here, there are laments that are written in here from today too. Let me pull one up. There's just different laments from the loss and for mixed feelings. And there's one, this is a curse on COVID-19, a lament for that. Maker of the universe, you want us to respect and care for all creatures, not to curse and destroy them. But couldn't we make an exception for this virus? It's terrible and doing so much harm. You yourself were not above cursing things. Remember how unhappy you once were with us? You sent a flood. And Jesus didn't go easy on the fig tree. He cursed it and it withered away just like that. I don't understand why, but I do know this. Cursing shouldn't be done lightly or often, but now seems like a perfect time. People have suffered so much. So forgive me if I'm crossing any lines here, but here goes. And then goes into a curse on the virus of COVID-19. Yeah. And so laments are still something that can be helpful to write today. I mean, as long as humanity's still writing poetry, laments still have a place. And so do the poems of blessing. Like the full spectrum of human emotion has a place in words for that.
Who's the owner? Is that Eunice Toman? Who's owner on our list here?
I believe it might be Eunice. I think Eunice's name usually pops up as that.
She likes to listen to.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it is Eunice, jump on in. Eunice, if you want to speak, you're welcome to. Or if you want to add anything into chat, you're welcome to as well. Into the written chat. So I thought we'd well, I've got two other things that I was thinking. One was the Bible study, the Bible Project video on Lamentations to kind of look at the structure. The other one I want to show you was a easy Hebrew alphabet song. So I want to hear what you want to hear first. Do you want to go with a kid's alphabet song, or do you want to see the in depth of Jeremiah? Alphabet break. So
whatever.
This is
either one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's we'll do the alphabet song and so that you're able to kind of see this is what as they're going through the structure, how they're structured within this is in the Hebrew alphabet. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Hebrew alphabet. So let's hear it.
This is the ancient Hebrew alphabet. We're going to do it in a couple of chunks. So first take a listen, then repeat, and then do it by yourself. Here we go. Aleph bet, Gimel Dalet Hey, Gimel Dalet Hey, Vav Zayin, Vav Zayin.
Oh no.
Yin.
Let's let it buffer quick. All right.
Chet tet yod, Chet tet yod, Kaf lamed, Mem nun samech, Ayin pei, Sadi kof reish, Din shin taf, Sin shin taf.
We won't don't do the repeat after me. But so that's the Hebrew alphabet. And if you'd like to learn it and want to listen to that song more, when all of the links I put on in the description on the YouTube. So if you just look up that recording, you can get to the links for all of the videos. And then you can come back next week and read in Hebrew if you want, or at least sing the alphabet song. So
That's the alphabet in Hebrew?
That's the whole alphabet in Hebrew. Yep. And so there's only 22 letters in Hebrew. And in the Hebrew alphabet, there are no vowels. And so it's only the consonants that are in the Hebrew alphabet. And in biblical Hebrew, as you're reading it in biblical Hebrew, you don't see the vowel markings. So in modern day Hebrew and add it to biblical Hebrew, they use a collection of like lines under letters or dot systems to indicate the vowel sounds. And so each letter you'll see, if you look at modern day or biblical Hebrew being written out, you'll see that there's dots above or dots underneath or a line underneath, and that indicates how it should be pronounced and adds in the vowel sounds. There also usually aren't spaces in between the words. So some of the letters are common letters that end words. And there is a way you would write the letter when it's at the beginning or the middle of a word. And then there's a way you would write the letter if it's at the end of the word. And so that helps to indicate if it's at the beginning or when a word ends based on how the letter is being written. So some of the consonants have the normal way of writing it, and then they have a final way of writing it too. The other thing, it's considered a block system. And so if you were to draw a box, that's what the letter would fit into a box. And which makes it easier to write it on scrolls or tablets, because you don't have a lot that goes outside of that box. There might be little tiny pieces that go outside, but not a whole lot that would go out into another line. And you saw it in what we saw, that's kind of the printed script, but it's written in all different ways, just like our alphabet that's written in all different ways, handwritten and script or different things. It is right to left. And so I don't know how that shows up on the camera, but right to left is how you would read Hebrew. So it's the opposite of how we read in English, which makes it easier to write if you're left-handed. It's easier to write. Speaking from experience, it's easier to write with your left hand going right to left than left to right. So it's a left-hander's dream to do Hebrew. So,
oh, for heaven's sake, yeah. Oh, okay.
But it's a really interesting language, and if you're interested, we can always add in little pieces about Hebrew here and there into our Bible study too. Although once we start New Testament, then we get into Greek. Not it, Old Testament's in Hebrew, but the New Testament's in Greek. So yeah, and as we read through this, I know the Friday Bible study, I believe they have been one of the people who attends that knows Hebrew. And so they've been reading it in biblical Hebrew, and then just to hear it, and then speaking about it, of course, in English with one another. But you do not have to know Hebrew to dive deep and to understand the poetry, as we talked about before.
The Friday group isn't on Zoom, is it? It's just in person.
They are on Zoom. So they're only live though. So they're on Zoom and they're in person.
Okay.
Would you like to be added to that?
I would.
Okay. They meet in the morning at 8:30.
I can't get over to church at 6:30.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
you don't even have to. They're on Zoom. I'm writing it down. So Friday Bible study. All right.
So later on, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll ask Donna to send you the link. She usually sends it out, I think Thursday. So let's take a look at the Bible Project overview, just to get, it's a little more academic than some of the other, well, alphabet songs and other things, and the feeling piece of it, which I think is really important as far as how do you hear lamentations in the midst of trauma. But the structure, as we've seen in other books, also really
The
matters.
Book of Lamentations. It's a unique book in the Old Testament that contains 5 poems from an anonymous author who survived and is now reflecting back on the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem and the destruction and the exile that followed. Remember the whole story from the book of 2 Kings. The fall of Jerusalem and the exile was the most horrendous catastrophe in Israel's history up to this point. So remember, God had promised Abraham the land. He'd given David victory to make Jerusalem Israel's capital. And from David came the royal line of kings. You had God's presence there in the temple, and that's where the priests maintained the rituals of Israel's worship. And after 500 years of all of this history, in the summer of 587 BC, the city fell to Babylon. It was all decimated and gone. And so the Book of Lamentations is a memorial to the pain and confusion of the Israelites that followed this destruction. Now, the lament poems found here are not unique in the Bible. There's lots of them in the book of Psalms. And these biblical poems of lament, they do a number of things. They're a form of protest. They're a way of drawing everybody's attention, including God's attention, to the horrible things that happen in this world that should not be tolerated. They're a way of processing emotion. So in these poems, God's people vent their anger and dismay at the ruin caused by people's sin and selfishness. And these poems are a place to voice confusion. Suffering makes us ask questions about God's character and promises, and none of this is looked down on in the Bible. Just the opposite. These poems of lament give a sacred dignity to human suffering. And so these human words of grief that are addressed to God have now become part of God's word to his people. The design of these 5 poems is very intentional. It's part of the book's message. So chapters 1 through 4 are called acrostics, which means alphabet poems. Each poetic verse begins with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is made up of 22 letters. Now, this very ordered and linear structure, it's in stark contrast to the disorder of the pain and the confused grief that's explored in these poems. So it's like Israel's suffering is explored A to Z and is trying to express something that is inexpressible. Chapters 1 and 2 each have 1 verse per letter, giving them a really similar design, but the themes are very different. So chapter 1 focuses on the grief and shame of a figure called Lady Zion. The poet personifies the city of Jerusalem as a widow, also called the daughter of Zion. And she sits alone. She's bereaved of her loved ones, devastated. No one comes to comfort her. It's a very powerful metaphor. And then Lady Zion speaks. She calls on the Lord to notice her fate. And through this image, the poet, he's showing that the city's destruction brought a level of psychological trauma on the Israelites that can only be expressed as the experience of a funeral and the death of a loved one. Chapter 2 focuses on the fall of Jerusalem and how it was a consequence of Israel's sin and was brought about by God's wrath, which is a key word in this poem. Now, it's important to remember that in the Bible, God's wrath is not spontaneous, volatile anger. The biblical poets and prophets, they use this word to talk about God's justice. So Israel had entered a covenant agreement with God, and for centuries they've been violating it by worshiping other gods, perpetrating injustice, oppressing the poor. And so, yes, God is slow to anger, but he eventually does get angry at human evil, and he will bring his just anger in the form of punishment. In the case of Jerusalem, this involved allowing Babylon to come and conquer the city. And so this poem is acknowledging that God's wrath is justified, but this doesn't keep the poet from lamenting and asking God to show compassion once again. Chapter 3 breaks this design pattern by having 3 verses per letter, so it's the longest poem in the book. And the voice is that of a lonely man speaking out of his suffering and grief as a representative of the whole people. And what's interesting is that this chapter is full of language that's drawn from other parts of the Old Testament, from the laments of Job and from other important lament psalms, and even from the suffering servant poems in Isaiah. And the poet sees his hardship as a form of God's justice, like chapter 2 said. But paradoxically, this is what gives the poet hope. And it leads him to offer the only hopeful words in the whole book. Because of the Lord's covenant faithfulness, we do not perish. His mercies never fail. They're new every morning. How great is your faithfulness, O God. So I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will put my hope in him. So the poet reasons, if God is consistent enough to bring his justice on human evil, then he'll also be consistent with his covenant promise to not allow evil to get the final word. And so for this poet, God's judgment is the seedbed of hope for the future. Chapter 4 goes back to the same alphabet structure as chapters 1 and 2, and it's a vivid and disturbing depiction of the 2-year siege in Jerusalem. And it contrasts how things used to be in Jerusalem of the past and how terrible they became in the siege. So children used to laugh and play in the streets, but now they beg for food. The wealthy used to eat lavish meals, but now they eat whatever they can find in the dirt. And the royal leaders used to be full of splendor, but now they're famished and dirty and unrecognizable. And the anointed king from the line of David has been captured and dragged away. So the poem's power comes from the shock of these contrasts, and it's exploring the depth of the suffering that Israel brought on itself. Now, the final poem is unique because it breaks the design pattern. It's the same length as all of the other alphabet poems, but the alphabet order is gone. It's like the poet can't hold it together anymore, and his grief has exploded back into chaos. The poem is a communal prayer for God's mercy. Israel begs God not to ignore their suffering or abandon them. And the poem offers a long list of all of the different kinds of people who were devastated by the fall of the city. They ask God not to forget these people, and they lament on behalf of others, giving voice to their pain. Suffering in silence is just not a virtue in this book. God's people are not asked to deny their emotions, but voice their protest, to vent their feelings and pour it all out before God. The book ends with something of a paradox. The poet acknowledges that God is the eternal king of the world, but also that Israel's circumstances make them feel like God is nowhere to be found. And so the final words of the book leave this tension totally unresolved. It asks, unless you've totally rejected us, and the book ends. The poet doesn't offer a nice, neat conclusion, much like our own experiences of pain and suffering. The story of the Bible doesn't end here, but this very important book shows us how lament and prayer and grief are a crucial part of the journey of faith of God's people in a broken world. And that's what the Book of Lamentations is all about.
Any thoughts from hearing that?
Hmm?
Any thoughts from that?
Yeah. I thought Helen said something.
No, I didn't. I'm thinking.
Oh,
There is.
sorry, Ellen.
Yeah, there is. I was thinking about, well, really, it's like today's world. I mean, there's a lot of grief and a lot of sadness, but you got to lament and bring it all to God. And I guess I wrote down all 5 of the main topics, and from when they had the fall of Jerusalem, and then all the way down to the siege of Jerusalem, and then the prayer to try to help these people in trying to I don't know, give them counseling and trying to work with their needs. I don't know. It's just I guess I never realized that the Lamentations was all in poetry. I didn't read it that way, and I'm just having all new thoughts on this now. It's been very interesting, but I'll let it go at that. I'm just thinking yet on it.
Excellent thoughts, Helen. Thank you.
What's the, I was going to say personality, that's not, what's the level of thought in our world today, or even in our locale or in our country, about threats from overseas? But I'm thinking mainly of the virus threat and is it, I can't even say it very well. Is it on the front burner for everybody? Or is everybody aware of it, whether they accept it or not?
Are you asking
Would-
just generalities or individually,
yeah,
personally, like here?
No, no, I'm thinking generality as a population. Virus word is said all the time, but how is it thought of? Good English, huh? Thought about.
I think it kind of, I share as far as what your different experiences are. I think it's depends on the person. And depends on, there's been such a political divide. We've in our country has turned COVID and health into a political issue rather than a health
Yep.
issue. And so that's created more of a divide, and even more so how people respond and how they think about it. And I know we see that here in Bismarck. There's some places where you go and everybody's wearing a mask. There's other places you go and nobody's wearing a mask. There's some places where people talk about they're getting booster shots for their vaccine, and then there's other places where people talk about where they're not going to be vaccinated at all. And so I think that changes how people encounter COVID-19 as a trauma too. But regardless, I think there's been a lot of trauma in people's lives, because I think everybody knows, if they don't know someone who's died, they know someone who's experienced a loss throughout this time.
Well, I had lunch with one of my lunch partners yesterday. He was talking about she had an appointment with her doctor about something else, but the subject of vaccination came up, and she asked him, no, he did not get vaccinated. This is her doctor. He did not get vaccinated. So you have, and earlier tonight, we're talking about the number of nurses. There was a thing on TV, the number of doctors in the country who are vaccinated and the number of nurses who are not vaccinated in our country. It's not balanced at all. That's just one area, let alone the general population.
That just blows my mind. People in medical field that don't get vaccinated. I don't know, not that all of us should, of course, but I mean, especially in the medical field, I cannot believe that they don't think that's serious enough to go ahead to protect themselves, because they're exposed to so many people. And they themselves, not having the shot could pick it up and expose it to someone, as the doctor. So, well, that has happened. My son was exposed to one of the doctors, but this was earlier during the COVID. And so he had to call all the people he was, involved with, and told them that he was diagnosed with COVID. So they were all quarantined for 14 days, of course. But, but he has since gotten the shots, so, but anyway, I find that, I don't know, I just find that.
We keep getting shut down here at Edgewood on a limited, I call limited shutdown, because we get one positive case in testing, and it has always been an employee. I mean, so far, other places have residents and employees who tested positive, but so far, whenever we had a positive test, it has been an employee. Go figure.
Yeah.
It's interesting as also hearing the prayers of our youth and our children. Each week I pray with different kids and things, and for the last number of weeks, couple months, as I've been praying with them, as we've had youth group and Sunday school again, they always bring up prayers like thanks that no one in their family is sick right now, or prayers for somebody who's sick. That is just constantly on their mind, and a fear that their loved ones will get sick. And that as adults, we have different tools at our disposal, different life experiences that our youth and children are just growing into and learning. And so I think we can see how some of that trauma manifests in our kids too.
Mhm. Well, like Mary wrote, COVID has caused great trauma to many. Mary, in her chat, wrote that. Yeah.
There's also blessings in our time, though, too. We have blessings of having healthcare that is far advanced from the health care of the past, when the world's gone through things similar to this. And so we do have a lot more things at our disposal. It's pretty incredible the length of the short amount of time that a vaccine was able to be developed. That's not always been the case in history, as well as the short amount of time that different treatment methods have been developed. And so there's a lot of blessings within that, plus the blessings of we do live in a world that, even though it feels like we're going backwards sometimes, that when you look at the statistics, we do have less people who live in hunger than there were generations ago. We have less people in extreme poverty than there were generations ago across the world. And so there's things about our world that are not, that we can give praises for too, in that mix of laments and praise, even collectively.
That changes it because of the help that has been given to people in poverty and all the different programs that have helped touch some of the areas. So there's less poverty and homelessness. It's
Yeah,
still a big issue.
It is a big issue still. Yeah. But it also shows there is an impact that we make when we reach out to one another. And even though it is slow, even though it seems to take forever, then even if we may not see the impact ourselves, generations later do see the impact of what started by us rolling the giant stone that it feels like, towards God's kingdom.
Well, help one person. That's one more than had been helped before. And let that grow from one to another. That's how I feel. It's like a pebble in the water. You help and it should move out. I'm terribly optimistic.
That's good. That's great.
I thought it interesting too, in Lamentations itself, it's a lamentation, but there are also a piece in there where you could almost hear the poet take a breath and be like, there's rain and there are still flowers. Like, God is still God. And then goes back to, I feel totally alone, but still there was a glimpse of some hope in there. And how true is that in times of grief too, and even in times of trauma, that as you walk through that, even if it feels like the majority is trauma or the majority of time is grief that you're sitting in, still there's usually little pieces of sunlight that break through at random moments and random times. And sometimes we can grab onto them, sometimes we can't, but they often still shine through.
It may be very simplistic to put it this way, but I think about gathering after a funeral. You're grieving the loss of a friend or a relative or whatever, and you gather with the attendees, as it were, and all of a sudden people are laughing because they're sharing stories, they're sharing remembrances of the deceased person. And to me, that's the light to go on also.
Yeah.
And not keep on the grief. I'm very simplistic.
Mary brought up the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, that it reminds her of that book. Did any of you read that book? It was dedicated to his son who had died as a teen, I believe. And I don't I don't remember, Mary, all the conclusions, but I think it was to the point that there's sometimes there just is suffering, and it's not that God causes it. It's not that um like God does the best God can, or God does the best with us in the midst of suffering, but there's still suffering.
Mhm.
Yeah, good point, Mary. Maybe another conclusion is that many of us are very tired of the many months of so much bad news. Maybe if we honor our tiredness, then we can rest before we can go on. I think that's very well said.
Mhm.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is.
I think you're right on. I mean, I see so many people, and we run it. It most certainly is easier to say than do. We're like running through it, and we're like, it's just a marathon. I mean, we even talked about it like that at the when COVID started. Like, okay, this is a sprint to the end, and then this is a half marathon, then this is a marathon. And we're going to just keep running, and maybe it's not a race at all. It's just this is the time that we are living in now, and it is exhausting sometimes, and it's okay to be tired, and it is okay to rest.
I think a lot of that's brought on with isolation. If you don't get out amongst people, then you're not able to release a lot of your bottled up emotions and such. Sharing with people, like we said, brief sharing, and so I think that's sometimes when after you're isolated a while, you just say, "Oh, I gotta get out of here. This is driving me nuts," and
Yeah.
but yet I am anyway. I'm a little bit leery about a lot of going places because I don't want to get sick,
Hmm.
but I do have my shots anyway.
Yeah,
But
that
but
certainly
Helen,
contributes. Go ahead, Louise.
Helen, well, I'm just saying Helen has the opportunity to go out if she so chooses. I'm thinking about people like some of the people here who have been locked down and
Yeah.
could not go out. We're not
Yeah.
allowed to go out. And boy, then the depression really builds in. Mhm.
Yeah, I could see that. I could
Mhm.
see that I would.
Yeah, the isolation, and even
Yeah.
for those who do go out, there's also an exhaustion and a pandemic that occurs even as you speak with other people. Then it raises your awareness of the loss others have too, and that is a piece of grief too, to acknowledge that sometimes it's not our own grief, but we also sometimes pick up the grief of others that they are feeling because we love them too, and we grieve alongside them.
Sure.
And like Mary said, acknowledging that is a valid grief that we have. And sometimes we try to, oh, it's not really my grief, I'm not going to think about it. And then it piles instead of being named, and let it be sacred ground even in the midst of that.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about, we almost need a retreat time together with just acknowledging grief. How do we walk through grief in the midst of
Mhm.
everything that's gone on in the past 2 years?
Mhm. Um, every year, Edgewood has a beautiful memorial service for residents who passed away the past calendar year. And they had, again, not too long ago, and this year they had 41 people acknowledged and who had passed away, which is much, much higher than the usual. But it was because of lockdown and depression and lack of contact. A lot of that was impacted some of the people.
Yeah.
Not all of them, but 41 is a very, very high number compared to all the years past.
Well, I'd like to wrap up with Mary's words too. Actually, that may we each honor our tiredness and may we rest too. And these words from Lamentations, restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. And may we carry that even in times of doubt, even in times when things feel heavy, but to carry that beam of sunlight with us too. Because we don't stay in Lamentations. Lamentations is an important part of the scriptures. It's an important part of our lives. It's an important part of the Bible. But it's not the only part of our lives. It's not the only part of the Bible. And it's a mix of so much. And it's all a part of the Holy Scriptures, just as it's a part of just sacred ground in our own lives. So any last thoughts? Otherwise, we'll let you rest tonight for the evening.
Then did we move on to Ezekiel?
Yeah, we'll start into Ezekiel next week. And so if you're up for it, we'll jump back into doing 24 chapters if that sounds good. Does that seem doable? Or do you want to try a shorter amount? I welcome your feedback is welcome. Otherwise, we'll do Ezekiel 1 through 24. And we'll see how far we get. If we don't get all the way through 24 next week, then those who read all 24, you just read ahead for the following week. And we're on schedule to complete the Old Testament before Advent. And so we've just have Ezekiel and Daniel left in our reading. And then we'll move into the New Testament. With a brief, we're going to stop after Daniel and read a couple of the books that are not in the Protestant Bible, but are in other translations and in the Catholic Bible, just for some added stories and kind of that what from the Protestant Bible, the extra canonical, just some interesting stories there with Bel and the Dragon and Susanna and the prayers that are said with Daniel as the lion's circle and things like that, just for some fun. And then we'll jump into the New Testament.
Yeah, lions.
So,
Sounds
and
good.
I'll send out this recording link right after this once it uploads. And a reminder, Ezekiel 1 through 24 for next week, 6:30.
Thank you. And you're sending the link for the Friday morning for me too, please?
Yes. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Okay,
I will.
thank you.
Yeah, I'll include it to everybody in case somebody's else is
Good.
interested in that.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.